Hi everyone, thank you so much for coming this evening. We're very much looking forward to hearing from Sarah Jaffe about her third and new book this evening. I'm sure many of you are familiar with her work already, but in case you don't know, Sarah Jaffe is a writer and reporter living in New Orleans and on the road, which sounds very cool, doesn't it? She's the author of Work Won't Love You Back, How Devotion to Our Jobs Keeps Us Exploited, Exhausted and Alone, which I suspect many people may have read here. And also Necessary Trouble, Americans in Revolt, prior to that. And of course, tonight we're here to hear about her new book, From the Ashes, Grief and Revolution in a World on Fire. It's a really rich, human and broad-ranging book, and I'm really excited to hear what Sarah's got to share. She's going to do a short reading, and then we're going to have a discussion about some of the themes, and then we'll open out for a Q&A, after which Sarah will, of course, be signing books if you'd like one.
Thank you. I'm so happy to have Emily here with me. Her book, I feel like kind of bridges the gap between Work Won't Love You Back and this one. I was like, you're writing about work and care and death and bodies and humanity, and made me cry a whole lot. And so it's really nice, and I'm excited about this conversation. So I just wanted to read a little bit, which is from the second chapter of the book. I'm just going to dive in. Mohammed Mira felt like he was always being tested. Growing up in Somalia, there were tests to take to get into university, tests that he was working to pass when the Civil War began in 1990. He had already done 2 years in the armed forces as part of a required national service program, and he wanted nothing more to do with guns or war. So he set out from Mogadishu to Kenya, and then from there, eventually, on to Nashville, Tennessee. That's where I met my beautiful wife, he said. Every time he speaks of her, he calls her beautiful. And where his 3 children, Abdullah, Dika, and Safa, were born. In Nashville, he worked a variety of jobs at rental car companies and driving a shuttle bus for airport parking. And from 2006, he was a taxi driver. He and some other members of Tennessee's Somali community banded together to start their own taxi company, Magic Taxi. They're still going, he told me proudly. If you go to Nashville, that's the taxi company you need to call. He was tested again when he got to Minneapolis in 2017. The family decided to move to be reunited with his mother, who had come to the United States in 2010. Everyone in Somali community, they spread all over the country, everywhere. Basically, we're all over the world, he said. Amazon was recruiting heavily for warehouse workers in the Somali community, drawing on recent immigrants, and the application process required an online form and then an in-person session. And then, he said, when you think that you get the job, they say, you have a test. He passed the test and took on the hardest job he'd had. There were cameras everywhere and a scanner that is like jail attached to his wrist so that it was impossible to put down. The scanner and the cameras were designed to track his movements, to make sure he was making quota. Every 3 seconds you have to stow one product, he said. Products brought by robots to the workers to be packaged. He began to feel like a robot himself, alone in a warehouse where the only time he spoke to another human was if he'd done something wrong and a manager showed up to tell him off. Human bodies are fragile, and they break and wear down differently than robots. They have good and bad days and children at home waiting for them to return. When the Amazon customer receives their package, Mira said, they should appreciate that everyone working at Amazon, they donate their blood because they're working like never before. Every 3 hours he got a 10-minute break, but just walking to the break room across the massive building took up most of the time. Bathroom breaks were timed, the scanner angrily warning him of time off task, the dreaded metric that resulted in write-ups and firings. And it's risky for you to fight. Fight he did, nevertheless, joining the Awood Center, a worker center based in the East African community. Awood is the Somali word for power, and the center built power among workers like Mira and Hibak and Safio Mohammed, and brought Amazon to the bargaining table, a feat not yet equaled in the United States by any of the attempts to organize Amazon workers, over prayer time and Ramadan observance. Amazon, like many companies, recruited workers who were new to America, presuming they would be docile. easily managed, unaware of their rights. But within the Somali and East African community, solidarity is a core value, Mira said. And the workers looked out for one another, holding walkouts when one of them was disciplined, a wildcat action upholding the principle that an injury to one is an injury to all. In 2023, the workers celebrated the passage of a statewide warehouse worker safety bill, requiring companies like Amazon make public their quotas and submit to investigation of their injury rates. Mira worked at Amazon through the first years of the COVID-19 pandemic and recalled vividly his fear of bringing the virus home to his family. Amazon orders were up, and productivity seemed more important to the company than the safety of immigrant workers. When I come home, my kids love me. They love me so much, they have to come hug me, he said. I have to stop them and say, no, hold on, let me change my clothes and wash my hands. They were so disappointed, but at the end, they get used to it. So they come, Daddy, you washed your hands? It was heartbreaking. The turnover at the warehouse was high. A leaked document dropped in 2022 found that the company's own executives feared that they might burn through so many people that they could actually run out of workers to hire. They take advantage of the Middle East, Somali people, and the Africans, Mira said, because they're new in America and they just hear Amazon, Amazon, Amazon. They don't know that a lot of companies pay more than Amazon pays. And those immigrant people, they make Amazon great. That's how they make money. Blood from the newcomers.
Thank you so much. When you read the book, what you'll find is Sarah artfully weaving together themes like this, like core themes of deindustrialization, migration, climate chaos, with personal stories of grief as well. And that was one that I particularly found. He's very memorable when you encounter him, and I hope you will read that part of the book. One of the things you talked about there is the kind of robotic nature of capitalism and how it turns, it assumes we're basically not humans. And you write in the book that grief doesn't happen on the clock of capitalism. Yeah. And repeatedly throughout the book, you're kind of pointing out there's no space for grief within the structures that we have. How do you see grief and capitalism intersecting? What do we need to undo that's happening?
Everything?
Okay.
Small question, small answer. Yeah, I obviously wrote this book because I had a personal experience of grief, and it made me realize that I was, in a lot of ways, I was incredibly lucky because I'm freelance, and that means I can kind of make my own schedule. Obviously, I have deadlines, big and small, but I was able to sort of finagle my way around my, days when I couldn't really function. And for a lot of people, for most people, really, that's not possible, right? You have to get up, you have to clock in, you have to show up, you have to teach your class, you have to work in the warehouse, you have to drive a taxi, you have to do any number of things, no matter how you're feeling that day. And then at the same time, I was talking to people who worked in places like the Amazon warehouse, had the experience, particularly during COVID, of realizing, like, our boss doesn't care if we die, as long as the profits keep coming in. And I talked to a couple of different people who had the experience of working somewhere on an assembly line in one case and seeing somebody next to them pass out, and the boss just kind of like yank them out of the way and plug somebody else in to keep the line going. And just thinking about the real impossibility of a system that will plug just the next person into the hole in the line, allowing us to really experience loss. And that it seemed not only sort of, difficult for capitalism to process, but almost impossible. That it neither can sort of accept us as individual humans with lives that are valuable, and also it certainly can't allow us time to acknowledge those losses ourselves.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think what is so powerful about what you've done in this book is draw attention to structures and processes that we disagree with if we're a Lighthouse event, but we also haven't seen through the lens of grief. So you talk about global care chains in the book, where poorer migrant women are moving from their home country to other countries to do the care work. And we talk about that, but we don't talk about the grief embedded in that. And you show that across so many structures, which is really interesting. There's a structural thing, but there's also the community thing. And I wanted to ask you, one of the things you write about in the book is that mourning, with a U in it, has been shunned as an activity in this culture that we're in, which I actually had never thought about, and I suddenly was like, oh my gosh, that's so incredibly true. We're so rude and racialized when we look at kind of collective mourning. I wondered if you could share with us your thoughts on kind of what mourning could mean for us and how we could do that differently, because you talk beautifully about that in the book.
So it's funny, I started watching Downton Abbey this week, because Maggie Smith died and I was really sad about it. And I was like, I've never watched Downton Abbey, I'm going to watch Maggie Smith. And one of the first things that happens, right, is some people die, and then there's a whole chain of events about inheritance, which we can go into on another whatever. But, and the girls are like, oh, how long do we have to wear mourning? I look terrible in black. And you go, oh, right, there was like a period of time, not actually that long ago, where there were like really ritualized practices, even in, repressed white England, for what you had to do and how you would show that you were grieving. And that sort of went out the door not all that long ago. And as you know, that it does end up sort of weird and racialized, right? And obviously, like the history of the British Empire was crushing out all sorts of practices of everybody that they colonized, and one of the first things to go had to be any sort of unruly mourning practices, whether it was like keening in Ireland or various funeral practices in places like India. And now, of course, if you can get bereavement leave from your work, you're lucky, but most people don't. And, so can you even go to a funeral? Is that even a thing? And then, if you are not connected to any sort of religious community, or in some cases, like political community, right? When I was talking to people who have been coal miners, a lot of the experience of funerals and memorials was around the union, actually, not necessarily even the church. But given that union got crushed, and so did a lot of the other ones, and the ones that are left are not doing things like funding pubs and football pitches, the collective spaces where people would grieve, a lot of them are really diminished. And then we see them sort of roaring back into the public in things like the George Floyd uprising, right? And in moments of Black Lives Matter actions where people are saying the names of people who have been killed, right? And sort of holding the space to mourn not only the person whose sort of name is top of mind, whether it's Sarah Everard or George Floyd or Breonna Taylor or Trayvon Martin, but also everyone else, right? And you're remembering all of the people that you maybe have lost, and mourning in some ways for ourselves. And so, to think about like what it might look like. And so I was just in Minneapolis a couple of weeks ago for an event on this book there, and the place where George Floyd was killed, it was outside of the convenience store, and there's a whole blocked off space on the sidewalk that still has flowers, and people bring flowers. It's down the street from the offices of a couple of community organizations that are also in the book, and so they were really sort of holding things down during the uprisings, these organizations that a lot of people haven't heard of. And there are these massive sculptures leading into that part of the street that say, they're just giant sculptural fists. And they say, the one says, "Welcome to the free state of George Floyd," which I love. And it's still there 4 years later. And in the street, they've painted all the names of different people. And then in a little park on the other side, there are, they're just plastic, but there's a set of tombstones, and it's all of these names of people who've been killed by police or the state. And it's really sort of something to walk through that and go, that one, and names that I would recognize, names that I don't recognize and have to look up. And going, right, this space has been made into an ongoing space of public mourning, which is so rare and strange and interesting to experience.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm sure most of us have never been there or seen that. It's really interesting to hear about it. Of course, one of the things that perhaps happens when we don't mourn is that that feeling has to go into something else. And you have a line in the book which is unforgettable, I think. Militancy as a short circuit for mourning, which could not be more appropriate at the moment. And I mean, I wonder what it's been like working on this book and now promoting it in the moment we're in with regard to Palestine, and also how you see this kind of militancy and mourning intersection in relation to that.
Yeah, there's just a new atrocity every 2 days to, and that's only the ones that we're seeing. And trying to hold that feels like it's going to make me explode. I'm assuming a lot of you have the same experience. And again, that we have to sort of go to work and do our normal things. And at least, like, my job is talking about this stuff, so I at least get to, like, say, like, hey, this is horrifying, guys. This is, like, we have to somehow exist in a world where this is happening, and our countries are funding it. I mean, mine more than yours, because I'm American, I'm sorry. But the, it's going to drastically affect the presidential election in ways that the Democratic Party is in complete denial about. And we are, sort of trying to figure out how to make it stop. And, like, how, what, in New Orleans, there have been a bunch of people who have been trying to stop boats shipping out, unconfirmed rumors that that's where they send the white phosphorus from. And in New York a couple of days ago, Jewish Voice for Peace barricaded themselves to the New York Stock Exchange. Some friends of mine were there. But it's just like, how do you sort of stick something in the gears? But also, I'm Jewish, and it was just the high holidays, and I was really struck by all the pictures and videos of people taking the rituals of this time and saying, again, with these big signs that say, mourn for the dead and fight like hell for the living, that we can sort of do both. We don't have to, the other line is the Joe Hill, don't mourn, organize. And you do get people who sort of say that, right?
This don't mourn, organize, you quoted that in there, and I assume it's a famous phrase.
Yeah.
I've never heard it before.
Oh, well, that's good.
Sorry. But it really hit me. It's not one of my questions, but I want to ask you more about that, because when I read that, I was like, did a man say that?
Yes,
sorry,
he did.
but like, don't mourn, so don't have feelings,
Well,
be aggressively act.
Exactly,
Like, what are you saying?
exactly.
And what, if you've worked for years on the union movement, on workers' rights movements, I'm really interested in you as a thinker, this overlap between the kind of emotion laden stuff you're talking about now and that world.
I mean, so the Don't Mourn Organize comes from Joe Hill, who was a member of the Industrial Workers of the World, and he was executed for a crime he almost certainly didn't commit. And the Don't Mourn Organize is taken from his last letter to Big Bill Haywood, where he said something along the lines of, don't waste any time in mourning me, Bill, go organize, which, easy for you to say when you're the dead one. I mean, not easy to be the dead one, obviously, but, great, I mean, thanks. So we lost Jane McAlevey this summer, and she was a friend of mine. And Jane had a lot of, she called it soldier mode. And the Baffler asked me to write a piece about her. And at the end, I was just kind of like, I could hear Jane saying, don't mourn, organize. Like, she would just be like, get back to work. Jaffe, stop it, And I was just like, nope, sorry, Jane, we're going to do both. That feeling that you have to keep going, that, that she kept going through multiple bouts of cancer. Jane's version of slowing down while she was having chemo was to write her first book, and then to write 2 more. 3 more, and that was her. But I think we can make space for both, and that also that if we don't make space for the emotional experience of it, then when we try to get down to the business of organizing and thinking strategically, we just end up like screaming at each other. And, you know, a few of my friends were on a panel with me about this book at the Socialism Conference in Chicago in August. And, you know, we were talking about that experience that like a lot of us have been when you're in the organizing meeting and suddenly like the trauma responses are just like rebounding around the room and everybody's triggering everyone else because like we don't have time to deal with our own various and sundry traumas and all of the, you know, the global ones that we're, again, watching every day on our smartphones.
Yeah, thank you. And I mean, what you're talking about there is this kind of partnership between the personal and the political, and the like bizarre idea that we can somehow separate them or be professional and not be personal ever, etc. So in the book you're twinning that as well. You're telling bits of your personal story and then you're doing these deep dives into these 5 thematic areas. So we tend to have a media and a publishing industry and academia which separates people into experts who are here in a professional capacity versus people who have lived experience of something and are here to share their pain, personal, very particular pain. And I think this book is refusing that binary, right? Do you want to share with us, like, what made you choose to do it in that way? What do you hope that doing that does?
Yeah. So Emily should say that she had a Twitter thread about this subject the other day, and I was reading it, and I was like, yes, we should talk about this. Because, yeah, you either get asked to be the expert at the front of the room who has done the research and has the facts and the whatever, or you are the person who has the feelings and the personal experience of it, and like they're so sharply delineated in these, I mean, frankly, very gendered ways a lot of the time, right? And especially if you are the woman who comes in as the expert, you have to sort of behave very seriously in a way that proves that you're not going to have any messy feelings all over the place, you know? And I just one of my friends who blurbed this book, I will not tell you which one, you know, he messaged me and sent me his lovely blurb, and then he was like, can't wait to see what the response is to this. And I was like, you mean you can't wait for the Marx Bros to get mad at me for having my messy feelings all over the place, right? And he was like, I don't know what you're talking about. So, you know, there's a tendency to assume, right, that like feelings are somehow again, they're messy, they're unintelligent, they get in the way of strategic thinking and all of that. And look, to some degree that's true, right? I was just saying we really have to deal with the feelings because then you can actually, you know, you have to actually process it, and we have to actually have space for that. But also, like, it's never completely processed, right? It's been 6 years and I'm not done grieving. And talking about this book all the time has kicked it all back up for me, like over and over again, you know? And that tension is sort of where we have to exist, right? That like most of us get interested in the research that we do, the political work we do, because something has personally affected us, right? This is something we do learn from the labor movement, that people get involved in organizing because of something that's happened to them. And to go back to Muhammad Mira for a second, I often have this fight with a certain kind of person who is very interested in the labor movement, but usually hasn't actually done any real organizing. Because they're like, oh, it's all about bread and butter issues and things that everybody can agree on. And I was like, the first people to bring Amazon to the bargaining table in the US were doing it over prayer time. They were doing it over dignity, right? And it's always about dignity. But there are so many different things that make people react in that way, right? For some people, it's having to go to work during COVID. For some people, it's prayer time. For some people, it's, you know, the way your manager talks to you. I was just in Chattanooga with the UAW workers who finally got their union at the Volkswagen plant after 3 tries. And this woman, Renee, who had been involved in all 3 tries, and she was like, they talk to you like you're a dog. And they're not going to do that to me anymore, you know? And yeah, the idea that there's some sort of cold intellectual calculus that we can have that isn't at some level motivated by who we are and how we experience this world is just, a misunderstanding of what politics is. And the question of expertise is just such a, it's such a weird one. Like, I was telling somebody a story of an editor trying to get me to go do a Barbara Ehrenreich where I could sort of get a fast food job and write about the fight for 15 from the inside. And I was like, well, no, because people need those jobs. And I've done those jobs when I, was working in that industry, and I'm not in any rush to go back to it. But also, like, the people who work there are perfectly capable of telling their own stories. And the idea that you would need me to sort of go bring my, graduate degree in journalism back to explain this to people, that somebody, that there's a class barrier, there's a race barrier, that this assumption that, like, you need a certain kind of person who can translate this into the world. And yes, I'm sitting here as a journalist, but, like, I don't need to, I talking to Muhammad, talking to any number of the other people that I spoke to for this book who are much more eloquent, like, at explaining their own experience than, like, I would be. I wouldn't have thought of saying that. Like, at another point, he talks about working at Amazon being like trying to hold back an 18-wheeler with your own hand, and that's how your body feels at the end of the day, that you've just been fighting a giant truck that's trying to run you over. And, like, you don't need me to be that person to do it.
It really struck me reading the bits with Mohammed how obviously there's been plenty of campaigning against Amazon for many years, but how we've kind of really acclimatized and grown accustomed to the way that it operates just being a kind of fact. And it was really refreshing to read the kind of accounts we used to read 10 years ago about Amazon again, and, like, feel it kind of coming home in that way. And yeah, I mean, he was a very powerful character. One of the things that was interesting about his story, and also that I think you do throughout the book, is, of course, there's, talking about migration and structural racism in relation to his story, and lots of the stories are talking about kind of very difficult things, tragic things, yet you are also showing how those can be a foundation for organising, for inspiration, for collective, for togetherness, right? You do it in a really great way that's not like toxic positivity. It's like, oh, it's wrong, it can be fine. But I thought it was really good to have that shown in the book. And it made me wonder, kind of, do you think there are particular stories you encountered as someone researching this that provided you with kind of healing or inspiration that you're particularly keen to kind of communicate to people?
Oh, yeah. I mean, there are so many people. I start off in the introduction to this book talking about sort of the choice to put my personal story in it, because usually you're a journalist, you're not supposed to do that, right? And it came out of the reporting as much as anything, that I couldn't sort of ask people to tell me all of these incredibly personal stories without being willing to say, like, this is why I'm interested in grief. And so that meant, holding people's hands when they cried. That meant really sitting with people for as long as they needed to talk. Texting afterwards, that keeping in touch and saying, like, hey, I showed up and stirred something up here, and, like, I have a responsibility to that. And Muhammad is wonderful. There's a young woman called Fatima who lives in Leeds, who has also got an incredible story, and just, she's been through absolute hell, and she was just at the end, she's like, I don't want to be called an asylum seeker, that's what I'm going through, but that's not who I am, and I don't want that to be my identity. And that, with everything that she's dealing with, she's just wants to turn it back around and organize and support other people who are in her situation. And, just, yeah, 19, I just like, my goodness. Who else? Idain in Minneapolis, also, who's a housing organizer, and she came to the US from Mexico and kind of left her family behind in contentious circumstances. They did not want her to go. And she left with her husband and, moved to Minnesota and really sort of discovered a whole side of herself that she didn't know about when she started organizing. And, this was just somebody knocked on her door and said, "Does your landlord suck?" She said, "Oh boy, does my landlord suck." And then became, not only the sort of lead on this campaign within the organization, then gets a full-time job with the organization, then starts running like political education trainings and all of this, and is sort of, facing up to a lot of the men that she's organizing around, their patriarchal beliefs. And yeah, I mean, she's probably one of the happier stories in the book, frankly, but because she's doing great. But yeah, I always find it fascinating to see like how people's entire lives are changed again when they get involved in organizing around something that, again, your landlord's terrible. There's mold and rats, and that's on one level like a very bread and butter issue. But again, it becomes about dignity. And when you fight around that and you say, we don't deserve to live like this, and it's not our fault, because of course landlords would be like, "Oh, you're immigrants and you must be just dirty and that's why the house has rats in it." And it's like, no, it's because you don't fix anything, and you don't spray and you don't do any of the things you're responsible to do, and we're not going to live with rats anymore. And it changes people's whole lives. It changes their relationship with family, it changes their relationship with friends, with bosses, with everyone they encounter. They get involved in politics and suddenly are, meeting with the governor, who might be the vice president if we don't have the worst case scenario soon. And yeah, and these are all people who are still facing a lot, as I think most of us are.
Yeah, and of course, I'm sure we don't highlight those people to do a kind of hero narrative, but to show we need these stories, we need these inspirations as we try to continually find the strength and the energy. One of the things I want to ask you before we open out for other people, which I'm sure all of the people you just talked about are managing. You talk in the book about not being able to outrun grief very powerfully. And instead needing to find new places for it to dwell. And I'm really interested in this idea that we're in a culture that constantly, or the kind of white Western Christian culture, that says pain is bad, you shouldn't be feeling pain, push pain away.
Yes.
Rather than a kind of how do we walk with pain, how do we hold grief, how do we dance with the awful things as well.
Yeah.
And you talk about ritual in that regard. Mm-hmm. And I wondered if you could talk to us a bit about where did you kind of come to with this idea of creating new places for grief to dwell? And does ritual help with that? Were there particular rituals for you?
I mean, I have gotten aggressively more Jewish in the last year because I refuse to let Benjamin Netanyahu and the rest of those monsters take it away from us. So, I did fun things like learn to bake challah and start, celebrating the holidays more specifically. And I was, texting a friend of mine who's been going through some stuff. And he's got some Jewish ancestry. He's not practicing, but I'm just like, it's Rosh Hashanah. Pour some honey on some apples, and you'll have a sweet New Year. And then it's like, go take some bread and throw it in the river and throw in everything you want to leave behind in last year. He did it. I don't know if it didn't solve all his problems, obviously, but like, sadly those still exist. They even followed me to Scotland. But like, the thing about grief, and as you were saying that, I sort of looked over here and saw the book. It was like bodies, and then my belly, and it was like, yeah, that's where grief is. Because I was really, really struck in the early days of how physical it was. And I had a friend who was taking a class to learn to be a death doula. And she gave me this worksheet that was like, here are all of the physical things that might happen. And I was like, oh, so I'm not having a heart attack. This is great. This is just, grief is actually like that deep that like, oh, my heart is racing at night. I'm suddenly breathing really shallowly, like up here in my chest, and I have to remember to like exhale all the way out. My sister and I talked about that one. We both really had the like, okay, you actually have to like remember to breathe out, and then you could breathe all the way in. And you know, I talked to, in addition to a bunch of people who were organizers and have political stories, I talked to clinicians and therapists who dealt with grief. And, you know, Jess Kuttner specifically was telling me, you know, she's like, I see people who come in and like, they're having autoimmune flare-ups, they're having stomach issues, they're having, you know, heart issues. Like, there is a wealth of research about the physical effects that grief has on you. And yeah, if you try to sort of stuff it down, it will just come out somewhere else. And you'd be like, why does my hip hurt? Why can't I walk this week? And then, yeah, I you know, at the same time, it's not something that like, oh, I did a ritual and now it's over. Now we sat Shiva for 7 days and now it's over. Oh, no. You know, it kind of will come for you still, even if you learn to recognize it, even if you make spaces for it, even if you take, you know, on this day of the week, we acknowledge this, on the, you know, on the year anniversary, the Yiddish word is the Yahrzeit, you light a candle, right? You have all these rituals, but some days on that day I'm fine. And then 3 weeks later, I'll be like, why do I want to murder everyone I know? And I'm like, oh, that's why. It's just coming. And you have to sort of learn to recognize it when it comes. And then, you know, okay, what is the thing I can do now to acknowledge that it's here, rather than try to like plan it and do it on my schedule, because it really doesn't like to happen on my schedule.
Or capitalism schedule, right? Which is a lot of what you're talking about. Yeah. So I'm going to open out to questions if you want to prepare them. Yeah, and I'll close our bit by just saying I think like to me, and the book is really like kind of radical incitement to see the grief embedded in the structures that we're living in, and to work out how to live with our grief and find places for it, which is serious work but also incredibly powerful. And it kind of ends up being something that feels invigorating if real, you know, deeply human but invigorating in that way that being deeply human is. Questions, are there some online? And there's one in the room. Okay, I'll take one from online. Do you want to take them in batches? Yeah. So yeah, one from online and then this person, yeah.
This one is from Jade, who says, what role should or could governments, institutions or cultural bodies have in making space for collective mourning rather than individual loss? Something that would respond to the forced forgetting of things like the COVID deaths.
Yeah,
I'm going to repeat it for the recording. That was quite long. What role should institutions play in creating spaces for collective mourning instead of kind of individualizing it? So thinking about the victims of COVID and multiple kinds of institutions in that regard. And then, yeah, in the room.
Will I just shout? I'm very conscious and very Glaswegian.
I don't know how far the mic will go, but if you want to...
This is so embarrassing.
He says as he gets up and gets the mic.
Turn around. Sarah saw me karaoke and it's very bad. So firstly, honestly, this book is so important, very selfishly for me, because the last 3 or 4 months have been extremely difficult. I've gone through the loss of a loved one, a partner, and then I've lost quite a lot of friends. Why am I getting upset? I want to be political.
See?
So thank you.
It is political.
So thank you. But,
Ryan's a labour organiser.
But that was the point I was going to make, is that as a trade union organiser, you're at your lowest ebb and you think, what the fuck am I crying about? I've lost a partner and some friends and a grandparent. This woman has just been sexually assaulted by her head chef and she's happier than I am, right? But then you realise that it's because you've not grieved and you've not got on with the shit before you get on with it. So I have got a point and a question here. What, like, as Mohammed Mira found out, or proved, as you found out as a journalist and as any good trade union organiser knows, the bread and butter is not the paying conditions. I'm probably going to get sacked for this. It's not the paying conditions, it is the dignity. It's the collective win for dignity, right? And both in the Western world and under capitalism and without things like Islam, we've lost that collective dignity, I think, as a trade union organiser.
Yeah.
And I'm organising the hospitality sector, which is the most individualistic sector in the British economy.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we force those unions, because I think hopefully we're all here thinking that the best force for change is the trade union movement, maybe not in its current form, definitely not in its current form, but how do we convince those bureaucrats and change the entire tanker towards what the actual workers, not just hospitality workers or the new workers. Yes, we want the aerospace workers, you know, we want the old workers of yesteryear, but can we win over the new workers? Yes, and we do that through moving the entire movement. The question is, how do we do that without, I mean, I'm at a stage now where I'm like, fuck it, let's start our own union. Like literally, it's that bad, and that will get me sacked. How do we do that? Sorry, Sarah.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, they're sort of deeply related questions, right? That it's like, how do we actually like convince institutions that like it matters to have spaces to grieve together, and it matters to think about what people are grieving and how and where and when and why. I mean, the government like mostly could, you know, give people time off. We could have more bank holidays. But also like statutorily, you know, approved right to grieve, things like that, right? Sure. There's also like the space of sort of creating memorials, right? I was really struck when I was doing the writing about the miners, and I went to Barnsley to go meet with Chris Kitchen at the NUM, and the first memorial statue that I saw to COVID was in Barnsley. And I did not think that was an accident because, of course, the miners have a great culture of memorialization. That, you know, that there are memorials, and like, you know, the president of the NUM at this point has, actually, they just closed down the last mine, didn't they? So like no active members anymore. It's all retirees. But most of his job has been fighting for retiree healthcare and going to the various commemorations of the various places where there were horrible mine disasters. And then the Durham Gala. And so that sort of culture of commemoration that again is being crushed by, you know, the end of the Union, that's not that far back in the labor movement's history, right? To think about like these were things that mattered actually. That the miners' union in the US would put days of mourning into the contract so that if people were killed in the mine, the workers would basically all go on strike, and it was a recognized strike right that they had to say, we're not working today, people died. And, you know, I don't think it's an accident that it was mining. It was an industry that killed a lot of people, fast and slow, right? So, yeah, unions, they really, you know, at the risk of quoting Jane too much, right? She would talk about whole worker organizing. And that means really recognizing all of the different aspects of people's lives and not just their paycheck. And not even just whether their boss is sexually harassing them, right? But like, also, how's your landlord? And like, cultural institutions would be that's a really interesting one actually to think about, because I feel like what's ended up happening at a lot of these book talks is I end up kind of facilitating, you know, talking about people's grief. And that's great, but also like, I'm really not trained in this. I'm just a journalist, man. Like, I'm like, oh my God, I'm holding a lot of stuff right now, and I'm barely holding it together myself. I was crying on the train up here, it's fine. And yeah, like thinking about my friend who was training to be a death doula, right? Like, oh my God, we need so much more of that work, right? Of people who really have been taught to hold this stuff for people. You know, I have a good therapist, but like that's, you know, what would it mean for that not to be something that I had to just do on my own? To like, I've got to write this book, and then I've got to promote the book, and that means I'm going to talk to a lot of people, and that means I'm going to need to like go home and process my feelings about it after that. But to actually have many more ways and spaces to do that in public. And the thing I kept thinking about again was sort of within movements, how do we have the sort of less formal but still connected social spaces for sort of basic social things, and also things like funerals, like mourning, like processing our collective crap together. And when I was in Minneapolis, the folks, I had Kat Salonik and Rod Adams, who were both in the book, come join me for my launch. And they were telling me actually about a training that a few of their organizations were doing together, where they were doing grief work, and they were doing sort of, you know, talking about like, what are the deep things that are bringing you to this work, and how do we make space for that? And doing this as sort of a retreat from the regular work of it, so that you could actually find ways to take care of each other and think about from that, like, what are the things, what are the structures we could build from there.
Thank you. We've got more questions. We've got something online.
Yeah, we've got a few online.
Okay, great. Let's take a couple.
Okay, so there's one from Cora, which is, what have you found, either of you, as people who have interviewed and worked with those who have experienced loss and had your own? What have you found is a concrete response folk need in response to loss when they share it? And the other one...
Can I just repeat that before you... So that,
yes, the folk online will have it in the chat.
Oh, they will?
So I think you're good.
Fine, great.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah. It's the people in the room that you'll have to...
Okay.
And then the other one was Dale. Are there traditions or cultures that you think we can learn from about making space for grief in the world that we exist in today? Thinking of the work of Jewish anarchists shared by the likes of Cindy Milstein, for instance.
Yeah. Yeah, Cindy Milstein's book is great. Yeah, I mean, like I said, I've gotten aggressively Jewish this year, and I think a lot of the grief rituals have been really meaningful to me. At one of these talks, actually, a friend sort of said, like, you know, one of the things is we do have these like really different cultures of grief if people are still connected to the cultures of grief that they come from. And sometimes, you know, there are contradictions, right? You're a Jewish funeral, you're supposed to bury people real quick, right? An Irish funeral, you have a big old party. Sounds more fun. Right, that there's time and space differences, there's sort of reactions to it differences, they're how the space is held differences. You know, in New Orleans, there's this tradition called the second line, which is from the jazz funerals, and it's got this whole structure to it where the musicians start off playing really slow, sad songs, and then as you go through, the music gets more joyful, and then by the end of it, everybody's dancing. And now they've sort of spun off, and now they're just second lines, like, for the fun of it, that aren't really even, you know, necessarily connected to, although they still happen as memorials. And people just join them. You know, you hear it going by, and people come running out of their house and join it. And it's such a fantastic tradition, and it makes sense that it's in a city like New Orleans, which just has a lot of very obvious things to be grieving. And that does sort of happen in public in a way that a lot of other things don't, right? A lot of funerals and gatherings will happen behind closed doors, and if you're not invited or you're not connected, you sort of don't go. But then when it's literally coming by my house, and I'm sort of like, oh, go see what's going on, you know. And a lot of the times I can't because I go to work. I can't like go, you know, jump out and join it. But you still like, you know, go out and sort of wave as people go by. And yeah, I wonder what it would be like to sort of bring things to the streets more. Not even necessarily always as a protest, but just as a like, we're gonna take up space now in the middle of the day, and that's gonna, you know, go by. The other question was about interviewing, huh? speak to that.
Okay. Yeah, it's. I don't know if the Cora it was right. Yeah, I don't know if they're asking because they're also doing work where they have to kind of respond to people who are coming towards them with grief, and you know, Sarah is having that a lot with the book, and my book talks about bereavement and care as well. So I often have that as well. And I think the way that I try to approach it, and I was just thinking about that, is probably I try to do 3 concrete things in that interaction. One of them is give the interaction time. Everything is so, this is capitalism through and through, right? If you're at a book signing and you're like meant to do it all quickly and like have a limited, not emotional, depersonalized interaction, but somebody is coming and telling you something with tears in their eyes, refusing the pace that we're all supposed to live at, and in that moment slowing it down deliberately. Secondly, I always try to make non-assumptive responses. So as someone with a parent who died, I get a lot of responses to me making assumptions about what she was like or what our relationship was like, which are not correct. Which make it, I'll pretend, but that's not ideal. So I will deliberately say things which don't say, oh, you must really miss her hugs. That kind of thing. You just say like, I'm so sorry. That must feel really terrible. You just say something that is trying to navigate that you don't know the ins and outs of that. You just know the person is coming to you with suffering. And the third thing I try to do is make sure they feel that what they're saying and what they're feeling is valid. So, when someone's welling up and saying, sorry, I'm crying, of course you are. I mean, I hope you are, and I remember years ago, I was definitely brought up not to show feelings, and 10, 15 years ago, I started crying at work because someone I really liked had resigned, which is a weird reason to cry, but it was a stressful work environment. And I started crying, and I was really embarrassed, and this work colleague, a man, said, I said, oh, I'm sorry, I'm crying. And he said, don't worry, I'll cry with you. And I was like, what the fuck? And I had this moment where I was like, it's permitted. And not only is it permitted, it's held by this person, and he will do it with me kind of communally, and it really blew me away. And I always try to channel Joe Beardsmore's energy now. When someone is around me crying or whatever, please cry. It's also releasing cortisol, which is good for you.
Exactly.
But yeah, so I don't know if that's helpful for Cora, but that's what I try to do.
Yeah, I think the time piece, right, is something I came back to over and over again with this book, and have come back to over and over again, just as a journalist. It's if I am asking people to give me some of their time, then they get as much of it as they want. I don't say when the interview's over, they say when the interview's over. Sometimes it's 15 minutes. I talked to a few people for this book who are really I will tell you my story, but I just don't want to, and I'm like that. You don't owe me that, nobody owes me anything. And then, yeah, I think there's not enough space for these conversations. And this was why I wrote this book in the first place, was kind of to pay forward the conversations that people had with me. Because one of the things about that kind of experience is I can't sort of pay it back to someone the same way they did it for me, because they've already lost their person. And, so instead you pay it outward, and you're like, oh, I heard you're, how are you doing? I have a few good friends that I basically met and, or had met once or twice, and then they, the next time I saw them, they were like, well, I don't know how to say it, but my father just died. And I was like, oh, I lost my dad this long ago. Would you like to get a drink sometime and talk about it? And that is also, a less formal version with more alcohol of what I'm doing when I'm interviewing for work like this. It's just okay, tell me how you're doing, and how that question means something. And then just on the, the journalist again, then I fight to keep their words in when editors want to cut them. Mm-hmm. Just real. I my editor with this book, I wrote a very long, sloppy first draft of this book, which is not normally how I work, but I was a mess. And unsurprisingly. And like, you know, my editor did a great job of sort of carving it down to something that's actually readable. But we did have like some pitched battles where he wanted to like take a person entirely out, and I was like, absolutely not. It's like, that person sat with me for 2 hours and cried, and I am not cutting their story out of this book. And actually, I'm excited because Elaine, actually, that I was talking about, we cut her story down a bit, and an editor for a magazine I work for was like, can we run an excerpt of this? And I was like, actually, do you want to run an expanded piece of it? And I will pull it out of my slush file, and we could get her whole story on the page, which is great because she's fantastic, as I said. So yeah, it's that like making sure that you sitting with me was, you know, worth it.
Yeah, thank you. There's a lot about ethics of publishing in there as well. I think one more very short question before we,
It's less a question of this, it's just a small sort of observation, is because when you're talking about cultures of grief, I think that's something that I might identify the trans community as, because it's one thing where the place that our identity originates from healthcare systems, from systems of pathologization, is also ones that systemically deny us the ability to grieve. And it was a tiny thing where it kind of reminded me of a title of a poem that I think is a great way of describing the kind of culture that we often live in. The title is the holiest day of the trans calendar is a funeral, or a mass funeral, because it's Day of Remembrance. And it's just a small thing that reminds me.
thank you so much. Thank you so much, everyone. I think we should now go and throw some bread into some water, but we're not going to.
Well, you can if you want to.
Right, everyone, Tesco and then water. Sarah is going to be signing books. There's also some beautiful letterpress prints available of some corkers of phrases from the book. So yeah, go through to the fiction, like through there basically, is where Sarah will be signing them. Thank you so much to Sarah Jaffe for being with us at Lighthouse tonight.
And thank you to Emily for holding it